All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving straight into something that, might surprise some folks just how many kids it affects. We're talking about handwriting.
Yeah,
For a lot of us, it's like second nature, right? We just do it. But when it's tough, oh, it can really throw a wrench in a kid's learning.
it can, yeah.
Mm.
And we're looking at a really comprehensive piece of research to help us unpack this whole thing. Um, Product and Process Evaluation of Handwriting Difficulties
Okay.
from 2003 by Rosenblum, Weiss, and Perush. It's going to be our roadmap as we go through all the different ways experts have tried to figure out, what these challenges are all about and how to even assess them.
Exactly. So think of this deep dive as your shortcut to getting a solid grasp on this whole topic of handwriting difficulties, how we understand them, how we evaluate them, all the key insights, but without drowning you in a sea of technical jargon.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics. Why is handwriting proficiency, something we basically expect all kids to master in those early school years?
Well, think about it. Those first 3 years of school are super foundational. And handwriting quickly becomes like the main tool kids use to show what they're learning.
Mm.
From worksheets to like their first little sentences, it all comes down to their ability to physically write.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there, right? Because once they hit like fourth grade, the demands just shoot way up.
Oh, yeah.
Longer assignments, essays, those in-depth test responses. Handwriting becomes even more crucial at that point as a way to express those more complex ideas.
Absolutely. And, for most kids, their handwriting does progress to a point where it's pretty much automatic.
Right.
It frees up their brains to focus on, what they want to say, the actual creative part of writing.
Yeah.
But for a good chunk of kids, this doesn't happen as smoothly.
Right. Which kind of leads us to some terms we should clarify. The article talks about poor handwriters, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, but then there's dysgraphic.
Right.
What does that specifically mean in this context?
So dysgraphia, as they define it in the article, refers to a very specific difficulty with the physical act of writing. So that's forming letters, getting them down on the page. It's not about a lack of intelligence or obvious neurological or motor issues. This is a learning-based difficulty that specifically impacts the mechanics of writing.
Gotcha. And it sounds like this is more widespread than some people might realize. I mean, the article throws out some numbers that are kind of startling.
Yeah, it's not a small issue. Research suggests that anywhere from like 10% to a whopping 34% of school-aged children experience handwriting difficulties.
Wow.
And this is even more common in children who have what's called developmental coordination disorder,
Okay.
or DCD, and also in those with learning disabilities, even kids who are generally described as clumsy.
Okay, so that's a sizable portion of kids potentially hitting this wall. So it's clearly more than just messy handwriting we're talking about. There can be real academic consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The article highlights the fact that a huge chunk of a kid's school day, somewhere between 30% and 60%, involves fine motor tasks.
Hmm.
And guess what? Handwriting is the big kahuna there.
Right, right.
So if a child is wrestling with this basic skill, it's impacting a massive part of their daily learning experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're constantly like struggling to even form the letters, how do you keep up with what's actually being taught?
Exactly. And the researchers actually propose that these difficulties with the mechanics of writing, they can actually mess with those higher level writing processes,
Mm.
like composing text. If all your brain power is going to just getting those letters down, you have less left over to think about, grammar, spelling, organizing your thoughts.
Right.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle while wearing mittens.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
just can't quite grasp it.
Right. So the physical act of writing becomes this roadblock to expressing your ideas in a clear way.
Precisely. And there's research to back this up. Studies have found a definite link between how well a child can physically write and both the quality and quantity of their writing. Kids who struggle, they tend to write less, and what they do write might not reflect what they actually know.
Right. And then there's the human element. The article brings this up, and it's a big one. The perception of the teacher.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, how does that play into all of this?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely something to think about. There's evidence out there that teachers tend to give higher grades to papers that just look neater regardless of the content.
Mm.
So unfortunately, poor handwriting can lead to lower grades, which can give a distorted picture of what a kid actually understands.
Right. So it's not just the kid's internal battle. It's
Yeah.
how their work is seen and judged by others.
Exactly.
Oh.
And that mental effort involved is a real thing. When producing letters isn't automatic, it taxes a child's memory and attention, which can really get in the way of those higher level thinking skills needed for writing.
Yeah, I imagine. And if writing is just this slow, painful process, you could lose your train of thought entirely.
Exactly. The article mentions this risk of kids literally forgetting what they wanted to say before they can get it down on paper.
Wow.
And that sets up this vicious cycle. They find handwriting tough, so they avoid writing altogether.
Right, which of course makes the problem even worse.
Exactly. It leads to what they call arrested writing development.
Yeah.
They might also be less inclined to put in the effort to plan and revise their work.
Right.
It just keeps feeding itself.
This must be so frustrating for the kid going through it.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the implications can spread far and wide. Studies from Canada and the UK have even suggested that early handwriting problems could be a sign of more general learning difficulties down the road.
Wow. That's a sobering thought.
Yeah,
It really makes you realize how fundamental this seemingly basic skill really is.
it is. And these struggles don't magically disappear after school. In fact, they can become even more complex in higher education or the workplace, where writing demands often increase. Even stress can worsen existing difficulties.
So it's not just an academic thing. We're
Right.
talking about self-confidence, job prospects, even personal relationships, according to the article. That's a huge impact long term.
It is, and that's why spotting these issues early is absolutely vital. The article stresses the key role that school psychologists play here, from helping teachers assess handwriting to planning interventions and tracking progress.
Yeah.
So being familiar with the different ways to evaluate handwriting, that's critical for them.
Absolutely. Early intervention is key. Now, the article digs into the history of how we've actually tried to measure and evaluate these handwriting difficulties.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's been quite a journey.
It has been. The initial goal was really all about finding standardized ways to score handwriting quality. But the biggest challenge right from the get-go was how to define what quality or readability even meant in an objective way.
Right, because what I find easy to read might be a struggle for someone else.
Exactly. Early evaluation methods tended to fall into two camps, what they called global holistic approaches and analytic approaches.
Hmm.
Any guesses on what those might be?
Okay, let me see. Global holistics sounds like taking a big picture view, looking at the writing as a whole. And analytic would be breaking it down into its specific parts.
You nailed it.
Okay, good.
So those global holistic scales tried to give an overall judgment of how readable a piece of writing was by comparing it to a set of standard examples that had already been graded from like super readable to practically illegible.
Gotcha, like comparing a student's work to a bunch of benchmarks.
Exactly. Some early examples they mention are scales developed by Thorndike and Ayres. Thorndike's focused on what he called general merit, while Ayres used the average time it took judges to actually read a passage as the grading yardstick.
Interesting, but I'm guessing these early methods had some major limitations.
They did. They found these scales were often pretty impractical for everyday use in schools,
Mm.
and more importantly, they were quite subjective and unreliable. Different judges could have wildly different opinions on the same writing sample,
Right.
making it really hard to get a consistent measure.
So how did they address that subjectivity problem? Did they move towards more objective methods?
They did. A guy named Freeman back in the late 50s made a big push for setting up clearly defined criteria
Okay.
to make these handwriting scales more reliable. He came up with a scale that looked at specific things like the tilt of the letters, their height, how they were shaped, line quality, and then an overall sense of merit.
Okay, more specific, but maybe still some wiggle room for interpretation.
You're right. It was definitely more detailed than those earliest scales,
Hmm.
but it was still kind of a general grading system. Interestingly enough, Freeman himself later revised his own scale, moving away from those specific criteria and going back to a more overall judgment of excellence.
So kind of a full circle moment there.
Yeah, a bit of a learning curve for sure. Then you had the Wisconsin scale developed by Herrick and Ellebacher. This was a real effort to improve accuracy. They used a massive collection of 200 handwriting samples for each of 3 grade levels, all carefully graded based on letter size, tilt, and overall readability.
Whoa, 200 samples per grade. That's intense.
It was. But you can imagine using that many samples made it incredibly clunky for teachers to use in a classroom.
Right.
It became more of a research tool than something for everyday assessment.
So the trend in those early days seems like a shift away from those broad judgments towards breaking handwriting down into smaller, more specific parts.
Exactly. The idea was that by zeroing in on those individual elements, you could get a more objective and reliable measure of readability.
Makes sense. So that sets the stage for how things started out. What about in more recent years? Did we stick with that analytical approach, or was there a swing back to those global readability ideas?
Well, it's interesting. There has been a bit of a resurgence in global readability methods in recent decades.
Hmm.
But the folks behind these newer tests, they've really stressed the importance of using experienced evaluators.
Okay.
People who've had a lot of practice with the scoring system before they apply it to research.
So bringing in that expertise to make those judgments more consistent.
Precisely. One of the tests discussed is the test of legible handwriting, or TLH.
Okay.
This one looks at both manuscript and cursive writing for kids from second grade all the way up to 12th.
Wow.
It uses a scale of writing samples that have been graded for readability, and whoever's giving the test compares the student's work to those samples to find the closest match.
So still a comparative approach, but with hopefully a more refined set of benchmarks. How did the TLH perform in research?
Well, some early studies found that there were concerns about consistency in scoring if different people were using the test with just the basic training from the manual. However, when researchers themselves, who had more intensive training, used it, they did see high levels of agreement. But there were also some critiques about how the test was validated. Often the studies used a relatively small number of handwriting samples, and it wasn't always crystal clear what the test was truly measuring.
So a plus that it can handle both manuscript and cursive, but the reliability and validity needed more digging into.
Right. Despite those critiques, the 2LH has been used in studies looking at how different handwriting styles like manuscript, cursive, and even combos of the two relate to things like how fast students write and how readable their work is. One study found that students who used a mix of slanted manuscript and cursive tended to write the fastest, though there weren't big differences in readability across styles.
Interesting. And it sounds like the TLH might even hint at potential learning difficulties down the line.
Yeah, there's been research suggesting it could help flag kids who might be at risk for later learning disabilities by looking at the link between illegible handwriting and their performance on other basic academic skills.
Okay.
It's even been used by teachers as a way to pick out groups of students with good and poor handwriting for research studies.
So a tool with potential, but some areas for refinement and more study. What about other global readability tests that have come out more recently?
Another one discussed is the Evaluation Tool of Children's Handwriting, or ETCH for short. This was developed by an occupational therapist, specifically to look at both readability and speed on tasks that are designed to mimic what kids would do in a typical classroom. And there are separate versions for manuscript and cursive.
Okay, and what sorts of tasks are we talking about here? What does the ETCH actually involve?
It involves stuff like writing individual letters and numbers from memory, copying text from both near and far writing words and sentences from dictation, and even composing a sentence of their own. Scoring focuses on the overall readability, how fast they write, and then it breaks down readability into things like the shape and size of letters and how they're spaced. It even looks at some biomechanical aspects like their pencil grip and how much pressure they use.
Okay, so it's pretty comprehensive, looking at both what's on the page and how they're actually writing. What about its reliability? How consistent did it turn out to be?
So the person who developed the ETCH reported moderate to high agreement between different scorers,
Okay.
but other studies found its reliability wasn't consistently better than some of the older handwriting scales, which was a bit of a bummer.
Right.
And there were still concerns about potential subjectivity because of that focus on the overall global readability score. Some researchers have said that the limited reliability and the fact that there haven't been many studies specifically on kids with handwriting difficulties should be taken into account when using it to evaluate how well a particular intervention is working.
So not as rock-solid reliable as they hoped, and maybe not ideal for those who struggle the most with handwriting? It sounds like teachers' judgments of legibility didn't always match up with the ETCH scores either.
Right. One study found no significant relationship between ETCH scores and how teachers rated legibility. So maybe those specific scoring criteria could be tweaked to better reflect what teachers actually consider legible in the classroom.
Okay. Any other global readability assessments worth mentioning?
The article does mention one more developed in Australia by Ziviani and Watsonwell. They use a 7-point scale to judge readability for kids between 7 and 14.
Okay.
They found no real difference in speed between boys and girls, but girls' writing tended to be more readable. Interestingly, there was also a low correlation between speed and readability. However, the article notes that there weren't any published studies looking specifically at the reliability of this particular scale.
Okay, so some interesting findings, but not enough research on how consistent the scoring is.
Right.
All right, so we've covered how those global readability assessments have evolved. What about the other big category, those analytic evaluations? How have those developed in more recent years?
So as we touched on earlier, analytic evaluations zoom in on Specific, objectively defined criteria.
Okay.
Things like how clearly each letter is formed, their size, the slant of the writing, the spacing between letters and words, and whether the writing stays on a straight line. There's general agreement on these key features, but the ways to actually measure them have varied a lot across different scales.
So different ways of trying to quantify good letter formation or consistent spacing?
Exactly. One early analytic method the article describes is called transparent overlays. Basically, you take the student's writing sample, print it on a clear sheet, and compare it to a standard outline of the letters. You score it based on whether the letters generally fit within those outlines.
Very objective, almost like using a stencil.
Right.
Yeah.
What were the pros and cons of that approach? Well, it was reported to have high agreement between different people using it to score the handwriting,
Okay.
which is a big plus for reliability. However, it was criticized for not being sensitive enough to pick up on those gradual improvements.
Hmm.
It could also be too sensitive to individual quirks in writing style, and there wasn't much solid evidence to support its overall validity. Meaning, was it truly measuring what it aimed to measure?
So it might have been consistent, but not the best indicator of actual handwriting quality or progress?
Right. Moving on from there, the article talks about Rubin and Henderson's scale. This one was designed to help teachers spot kids struggling with handwriting.
Okay.
They use 6 specific criteria: overall readability, accuracy of letter formation, consistency in size and tilt spacing between letters and words, and how straight the writing was on the line. Each of those was rated on a 4-point scale. The task was copying a short paragraph with a 5-minute time limit.
How did that scale do in terms of reliability?
It showed very high levels of both test-retest reliability, meaning a kid would likely get a similar score if they took it again soon after, and iterator reliability, so different teachers using it would give similar scores to the same writing.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, a big improvement over some of those earlier methods.
What other analytic approaches were there?
Well, there was the Alston Evaluation Scale, which took a slightly different route.
Okay.
It had a 20-item questionnaire for teachers to fill out about features that could affect readability. The kid's task was to write a freestyle essay in 20 minutes on lined paper using whatever writing tool they liked.
Okay.
Early on, it showed moderate to high reliability and validity. But a later study found that only a handful of those questionnaire items actually related to readability, so they recommended redefining the scale.
Gotcha. So a good idea initially, but the specific questions needed some fine-tuning.
Exactly. Then there's the Ziviani and Elkin scale, which focused on manuscript handwriting for kids aged 7 to 14. They looked at several key components of readability: how well letters were formed, their size spacing, straightness of lines, and also speed. They even laid out very precise guidelines for forming individual letters.
Very detailed.
Yeah, they used transparent overlays with straight lines to assess alignment and rulers to measure spacing. Speed was measured by how many times the kid could write cat and dog in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Their research showed moderate to high iterator and test-retest reliability,
Good.
and also moderately high content and criterion validity, meaning it seemed to be measuring what it was supposed to, and the scores lined up with other handwriting measures. They even developed speed norms that matched up with some earlier studies.
So a more refined tool with decent research backing it up, what were some of its drawbacks?
Well, while it had the advantage of very clear criteria, they didn't really explain why they chose those specific criteria as the most crucial for readability. And it didn't really consider inconsistencies in size or slant within a single piece of writing or distortions caused by poor motor control, which are often big challenges for kids with poor handwriting.
So focused on the static features, but maybe missed some of the dynamic elements that contribute to messy writing.
Right. Next up, the article discusses the Children Handwriting Evaluation Scale, or CHES. This one was for cursive writing in grades 3 through 8.
Okay.
It measured both quality and fluency. The task was copying a short story onto blank paper. Speed was based on how many letters were copied in 2 minutes compared to existing norms. Quality was judged on a 5-point scale, looking at things like letter shape, tilt, rhythm, spacing, and overall appearance.
What about its reliability and those speed norms they established?
They reported moderate to high agreement between scorers, but their speed norms were actually lower than those found in some other studies. Later, they made a similar scale, the CHESM, for manuscript writing in earlier grades. But the CHES did get some flack. Some folks argued that the 5-point rating scale might not be sensitive enough to pick up small changes over time. And there were also questions about having kids write on blank paper, since research on lined versus unlined paper has been mixed.
Right. So potential issues with the sensitivity of the scoring and the way the test is set up.
Exactly. Then there's the Concise Evaluation Scale for Children's Handwriting BHK from Germany. It was designed as a quick screening tool to catch potential readability and speed problems in young kids who might have dysgraphia.
Okay.
The kid copies a standard text that gets progressively more complex over 5 minutes.
Hmm.
The quality is judged based on deviations from that standard text using 13 specific criteria,
Okay.
and speed is measured by the number of letters written in those 5 minutes. This one has a lot of research behind it.
Oh, that's good.
They've established solid norms for second and third graders, and it's been studied in various groups of kids. It shows high inter-rater reliability, good correlation with teacher judgments, and longitudinal studies have shown it's sensitive to developmental changes and can tell the difference between kids with and without dysgraphia.
Okay.
Plus, it's been used to look at the effects of things like chemo and physiotherapy on handwriting skills.
Sounds like a solid tool with lots of evidence to back it up.
It is. Moving on to the next one. It's called the Diagnosis and Remediation of Handwriting Problems, or DRHP.
Okay.
It tries to pinpoint the root causes of handwriting struggles, lumping them into 3 categories. Problems with teaching or learning performance mistakes due to lack of motor control or inefficient writing posture or manner, though that last one wasn't formally scored. It measures the number and types of errors affecting readability compared to a set of samples.
So trying to get at the why, not just the what of the problem. How strong is the research on this one?
Unfortunately, the research on the DRHP is on the weaker side. Initial reports didn't provide norms, retest reliability, or strong validity evidence. Later research did find moderate inter-rater reliability,
Yeah.
but overall it lacks the robust research base of some of the other scales.
Gotcha. So a potentially helpful framework for understanding the causes, but needs more rigorous testing.
Right. Now we come to the Minnesota Handwriting Test. It was created to help occupational therapists and schools identify handwriting difficulties and assess how well their interventions are working.
Okay.
It has norms for first and second grade and focuses on manuscript writing. The kid copies a scrambled sentence, writes for 2.5 minutes. Then the examiner marks the last letter they wrote and they keep going.
Okay.
Quality is evaluated based on readability, letter shape, straightness of lines, size, and spacing. They also calculate writing speed based on how many letters were written those initial 2.5 minutes.
And did they look at the physical aspects of writing at all?
Yes, they included observations of things like pencil grip, attention level, and posture,
Mm.
but those weren't part of the formal scoring.
Mm.
The manual does have practice samples to help trained examiners, and importantly, studies have shown high agreement between both experienced and less experienced folks using the test, meaning the instructions are clear and easy to follow.
That's key for actually using it in schools.
Absolutely. Lastly, we have a scale specifically for Hebrew handwriting.
Oh, wow.
It's called the Hebrew Handwriting Evaluation, or HHE.
Mm.
Hebrew has its own unique features.
Hmm.
It's written right to left, has different spacing rules, uses non-connecting letters, and has different forms for letters at the end of words.
Right.
So existing scales for languages like English just wouldn't cut it. The HHE has 3 tasks: copying the alphabet in an unusual order, copying a short story, and writing a story from dictation.
Okay.
It looks at writing speed, quality, ergonomic factors like pressure grasp and posture and types of errors. It's shown moderate to high inter-rater reliability. They've established norms for writing speed in second and third grade, and there's evidence for its validity showing clear differences between good and struggling writers.
Mm.
It also showed high internal consistency, meaning the different parts of the test seem to be measuring a similar underlying skill. And interestingly, it could even differentiate performance based on those ergonomic factors, showing their importance in Hebrew handwriting.
That's really interesting how those cultural and linguistic factors play into not just how we write, but also how we assess it.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground looking at those specific evaluation tools. The article then dives into some broader issues that crop up across both analytic and global handwriting evaluations. It sounds like there are some recurring challenges in this field.
Yeah, definitely. Well, everyone agrees on the importance of readability and those main features like size, slant, spacing, shape, and overall quality. There's actually a surprising amount of variation across different scales, and these variations can have a big impact on a student's score.
Like what? Can you give me some examples?
Sure, the actual tasks kids are asked to do differ a lot. Some involve copying shapes and letters, others use paragraphs, dictation, or even essays. The instructions vary too. Some say write as fast as you can, others say write as neatly as you usually do. Then you've got differences in writing materials, lined versus unlined, paper-specific pen or pencil, even whether they can use an eraser.
So a bunch of uncontrolled variables that could be skewing the results.
Exactly. And the criteria used to judge handwriting and how those criteria are graded vary wildly, even for something as basic as letter formation. Then you have different ways to measure speed and varying levels of research backing up each scale's reliability, validity, and suitability for different groups of kids.
Okay, and what about who's qualified to give and interpret these tests? That seems like a pretty big deal.
It is. And the article points out that most assessments are vague about who's actually qualified, whether it's teacher's therapist or even if self-assessment is okay. They often lack details on how much training someone needs before using the scale. This lack of standardization can really affect the consistency and reliability of those scores. The ETCHM was one of the few with more specific requirements for evaluator prep. Some research has suggested that more experienced teachers might be better judges of handwriting, and even the examiner's understanding of the test's purpose could subtly bias their scoring.
Makes sense. If everyone's scoring the same handwriting differently because they haven't been trained in the same way, the results aren't going to be very meaningful.
Right. And then there's the question of the criteria themselves. Is there a universally accepted standard for what makes good handwriting?
Right.
Well, not really. While there's general agreement on the importance of legibility and those core features we've talked about, there's still debate about which are the most crucial and, even more importantly, how to objectively measure them. The grading scales for these features can be all over the map. This lack of clear and consistent definitions in grading just adds to the reliability problem. And we don't even fully understand which combinations of these features are most critical for readability. Even letter formation, something that seems pretty straightforward, is judged in very different ways across different scales.
So we're trying to measure the same thing with different rulers,
Exactly.
which makes it hard to compare findings and even to know what to target in interventions.
Exactly. And the article brings up the point that while everyone agrees letter formation is important for legibility, the different ways of measuring it make it hard to compare data across studies. We also don't have a great understanding of how these legibility features typically change as kids get older.
What about the tasks themselves? Does it matter what kids are asked to write when we're assessing their handwriting?
It absolutely does. But the scales often don't consider how the task's complexity might affect performance or explain why they chose a specific assignment. You've got everything from copying shapes and letters to full-blown essays. And the rationale isn't always clear. Research has shown that people write differently when they're copying versus writing creatively. And even the personal meaning of the task for the child can play a role. Things like the length of the sample, whether it's copying or dictation, are also important considerations in real-world settings. The article even points out instances where a test might have a very specific word count without any explanation as to why.
Sound like the design of these handwriting tasks needs more careful thought to make sure they're actually tapping into a kid's typical handwriting.
Agreed. And those instructions given to the students can make a difference too. Subtle wording changes like write as fast as you can versus write as neatly as you usually do can impact their performance. And even past experiences with writing and any associated emotions like anxiety or frustration could factor in.
It really highlights how intricate this whole act of writing and its assessment can be.
Yeah,
What about the physical stuff, like the type of paper or writing tool? Do those things matter?
they can. Some assessments use lined paper, others unlined, and the reasoning isn't always given. Plus, the research on lined versus unlined paper for legibility, especially for younger kids, has been mixed. Even line width can affect handwriting quality. And most tests say to use a pencil, but things like whether it should be sharpened or if they can use their own might differ.
Right.
And whether or not they can use an eraser can also affect the final product. These might seem like small details, but they can impact speed and readability, yet they're not always controlled or clearly reported.
So more consistency across these practical elements is crucial for getting reliable results.
For sure. And then there's the fact that everyone's handwriting is unique. As people develop their writing, they tend to develop their own style, and it can even change from day to day or within a single piece of writing.
Right.
Many scales don't fully account for these individual or developmental quirks, which could lead to misjudging a kid's actual abilities.
Yeah, we don't want to penalize someone for just having their own style.
Exactly. And another thing to consider is that most of these scales are laser focused on the end product, the writing itself.
Okay.
They don't really pay attention to what the kid's going through while they're writing.
Yeah.
Only a couple of scales mentioned actually make note of things like signs of stress or fatigue or how often they take breaks. These process-oriented observations could be really helpful in understanding their struggles.
Yeah, those could provide some valuable clues. What about the practical side of using these scales? How easy are they to actually use and score in real-world settings?
Well, there's often a trade-off between efficiency and how objective and detailed the scoring is. Some early attempts at quick scoring were very subjective.
Right.
Scales that involve comparing to tons of samples can be accurate but take forever for teachers to use regularly.
Right.
And those precise measurement methods can be really time-consuming too.
Mm.
So far, there's no magic bullet that's both quick and highly accurate,
Mm.
which might be why teacher observations are still so common, even though they have their own limitations. This lack of practical and reliable tools could also be contributing to the fact that handwriting difficulties often aren't caught and addressed early enough.
So we need tools that are reliable, valid, and also user-friendly for busy educators and therapists. And of course, we have to talk about reliability and validity, those cornerstones of any good assessment. How do these handwriting scales measure up in those areas?
That's where a lot of them still need work. Many have limited research on their psychometric properties. Some use samples that might not represent the wider population, and others haven't properly addressed whether they work equally well for different groups, like boys versus girls. The reported reliability numbers vary a lot, and some are actually too low to be confident about using the scores to make decisions about a student's handwriting.
Hmm.
And the situation with validity, whether the scale is truly measuring what it claims to, is even worse for many. Some lack validity studies altogether, or have only been tested with typically developing kids. So there's a clear need for more rigorously developed and tested tools.
Agreed. If we can't trust the tools, we can't be sure we're accurately identifying and helping those kids who are struggling. And are these scales generally applicable across the board in different settings and populations?
Many were developed but haven't been extensively studied in different contexts. The TLH and the BHK stand out as having been investigated more thoroughly. Studies show they're sensitive to different types of difficulties, can explore the relationship between writing style and readability, can identify kids at risk for learning problems in the case of the TLH, and can even track developmental changes, distinguish between kids with and without dysgraphia, and assess the effects of treatments, like with the BHK.
So some tools have a broader base of evidence than others.
Right.
One thing we haven't really touched on is the student's own perspective. Are they typically involved in the assessment of their own handwriting?
That's a great point, and one that's often missed. The article actually emphasizes the importance of self-evaluation. Research suggests that even teaching young kids to evaluate their own handwriting, based on clear guidelines, can really boost improvement and self-awareness.
Hmm.
Studies have shown that kids can be surprisingly good at it when given the right criteria. But none of the scales reviewed actually include self-assessment as an option.
Mm-hmm.
This might be because people don't realize how beneficial self-reflection can be, or they think only professionals can judge handwriting accurately. But research has found that even kids with generally legible handwriting might still be unhappy with parts of it,
Yeah.
which really shows how important it is to build those self-awareness and self-evaluation skills.
That's a really interesting point. Giving students that ownership over their own writing could be a powerful tool. And finally, we have to talk about speed. It's not just about how neat their writing is, but how quickly they can produce it right.
Absolutely. For handwriting to be truly useful, it needs to be both legible and reasonably fast. Yeah. However, the way writing speed is measured is all over the place.
Yeah.
Some measure the time it takes to write something specific, others measure how much they can write in a set time, and the time limits vary wildly from 1 minute to 5 or more. This, along with differences in teaching methods and letter forms across different countries, has led to very inconsistent findings in speed studies.